When the ground shook at 2 a.m., Cora thought it was an earthquake. Instead, it was a fleet of flatbed trucks illegally dumping 800 rotting, wine-soaked oak barrels onto her failing dairy farm. Her billionaire neighbor wanted to bury her in disposal fees and steal her land for pennies. He almost succeeded, but he didn't realize he hadn't dumped garbage. He'd dumped premium French oak. This is the story of how one woman turned an act of corporate sabotage into a six-figure revenge empire. The Higgins dairy farm had been bleeding money for the better part of a decade. Situated in the rolling, fog-draped hills of the Sonoma Valley outskirts, the 400-acre property was a relic of a bygone era. While the surrounding landscape had been aggressively bought up, terraformed, and manicured into pristine, high-end vineyards, Cora Higgins was still milking Holsteins and shearing sheep. At 34, Cora was calloused, perpetually exhausted, and fiercely protective of the land her great-grandfather had settled. But grit doesn't pay the mortgage. The price of wholesale milk had plummeted, feed costs had doubled, and the bank was breathing down her neck about a balloon payment she had no hope of making. She had precisely $4,218 in her checking account. It was a crisp Tuesday in late October when the final blow seemed to land. At 2:14 a.m., Buster, her aging blue heeler, started barking frantically at the back door. Cora groaned, pulling herself out of a deep, exhausted sleep. She assumed it was coyotes testing the perimeter of the sheep paddock again. She threw on her heavy Carhartt jacket over her flannel pajamas, slipped her bare feet into cold rubber muck boots, and grabbed the heavy Maglite flashlight from the kitchen counter. When she stepped onto the back porch, the frigid autumn air hit her lungs, but it wasn't the cold that made her freeze. It was the sound. It wasn't coyotes. It was the deep, rhythmic, guttural idle of heavy diesel engines. More than one, and they were coming from her lower pasture, a 50-acre stretch of dormant grass that bordered the sprawling estate of her neighbor, Castelli Vineyards. Cora sprinted to a rusted Ford F-150, threw it into gear, and tore down the dirt access road, her headlights slicing through the dense Northern California fog. As she crested the small hill overlooking the pasture, she slammed on the brakes. Down in the valley, illuminated by the harsh, glaring halogen works lights of three massive flatbed semi-trucks, a desecration was taking place. The heavy, barbed wire fence separating her land from the Castelli estate had been severed and dragged aside. The flatbeds were actively reversing onto her property. As she watched in horror, the hydraulic beds of the trucks began to tilt upward. "Hey, stop! What the hell are you doing?" Cora screamed, laying on her truck's horn. Her voice was entirely drowned out by the thunderous, apocalyptic crashing of wood on earth. Hundreds of massive 60-gallon oak wine barrels began avalanching off the back of the trucks. They slammed into the dirt, smashing into one another with violent, splintering crunches. Metal hoops shrieked against metal. The heavy oak staves groaned and cracked under the immense weight of the pile. Cora scrambled out of her truck and ran down the hill, waving her flashlight wildly. "Stop the trucks! Get off my land!" The drivers didn't even look at her. The moment the last barrel tumbled off the beds, the hydraulic lifts slammed back down. The trucks shifted into gear, their massive tires churning up deep, muddy ruts in her winter pasture, and accelerated back across the property line into the manicured darkness of the Castelli estate. Cora stood alone in the freezing fog, coughing on the thick cloud of diesel exhaust and dust. She turned her flashlight toward the pile. It was a mountain, a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of dead wood. There were easily 800 barrels, stacked haphazardly in a massive mound that spanned half a football field. As the dust settled, the smell hit her. It was overpowering, a suffocating, sickly, sweet stench of rotting yeast, decaying grapes, and damp, mildewed wood. These were spent barrels, the refuse of a massive commercial winemaking operation. Cora walked slowly toward the towering pile, her boots crunching on splintered oak. She shone her flashlight onto the head of one of the barrels resting near the edge. There, burned into the pale wood in elegant, sweeping calligraphy, was a logo she recognized all too well: Castelli Estate Vineyards. Her hands began to shake, not from the cold, but from a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated rage. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a careless dumping by a rogue contractor. This was a calculated, deliberate act of war. She knew exactly why they were there. For 3 years, the Castelli family had been trying to buy her lower pasture. It was prime viticultural land, featuring the exact soil composition they needed to expand their premium Pinot Noir vines. Cora had repeatedly refused to sell. Now they had turned her pasture into an illegal agricultural landfill. And as Cora stared up at the mountain of rotting oak, a cold, sickening realization washed over her. Commercial disposal of this volume of hazardous agricultural waste wouldn't just be expensive, it would bankrupt her entirely. The true scale of the devastation was only visible in the harsh light of morning. The pile of barrels looked like a shipwreck in a sea of green grass. The deep ruts from the semi-trucks had torn up the soil, exposing the muddy clay beneath. Some of the barrels had shattered upon impact, spilling dark, sludgy wine lees, the thick sediment of dead yeast and grape skins, into the earth. The pungent smell had already attracted swarms of yellow jackets. At 8 a.m., Cora stood by her truck with Sheriff Miller, a man who looked like he had been tired since the late 90s. He pushed his wide-brimmed hat back on his head and sighed, writing half-heartedly on his clipboard. "I hear what you're saying, Cora," the sheriff said, his voice slow and heavy. "But trespassing is tricky when property lines are involved, and frankly, this looks like an agricultural dispute." "An agricultural dispute?" Cora snapped, gesturing wildly at the mountain of wood. "It's illegal dumping. They cut my fence and dumped 10 tons of garbage on my property in the middle of the night." Before the sheriff could answer, the crunch of expensive tires on gravel interrupted them. A sleek, jet-black Range Rover pulled up to the severed fence line on the Castelli side. The door opened, and out stepped Preston Castelli. Preston was 32, dressed in a custom-tailored tweed blazer and expensive Chelsea boots that looked like they had never touched actual dirt. He was the heir to the Castelli fortune, a man who had been handed a multi-million-dollar empire and managed it with the smug entitlement of a tech bro playing a farming simulator. "Sheriff Miller," Preston called out, his smile perfectly bright and entirely devoid of warmth. "And neighbor Higgins, good morning." "You piece of garbage," Cora took a step forward, her fists clenched. "You think you can just dump your waste on my land?" Preston raised his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes gleamed with predatory amusement. "Whoa, let's keep it civil, Cora. And frankly, I have no idea what you're talking about regarding your land." He pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and handed it over the broken fence to the sheriff. "We had the estate resurveyed last month," Preston said smoothly. "According to the original county plat maps from 1922, the property line isn't the fence. It's actually a natural creek bed, about 50 yards onto what Cora assumes is her pasture. Technically, that pile of retired barrels is resting comfortably on Castelli estate land. We're simply utilizing our acreage for temporary storage." Cora stared at him, stunned. "That fence has been the established property line for 80 years. My grandfather built it. Your grandfather agreed to it." Preston offered a sympathetic pout. "Verbal agreements from dead men don't hold up in court, Cora. The land is ours, which means the barrels stay." Before Cora could lunge across the fence, another vehicle arrived. It was a white county pickup truck with the Environmental Protection Division logo on the side. A woman with a clipboard stepped out, navigating the mud. "Cora Higgins?" the inspector asked. "Yes," Cora replied, her stomach dropping. "We received an anonymous tip this morning about a major agricultural waste hazard," the inspector said, looking at the leaking barrels and the swarm of insects. "Wine lees are highly acidic. They can ruin the water table if they seep into the groundwater. Because this hazard is located within the tax-assessed boundaries of your active farm, I have to issue you a citation." "What?" Cora yelled. "He literally just claimed the land is his." "He's claiming it in a civil property dispute," the inspector clarified, looking apologetic but firm. But on the official county tax ledger, you are the owner of record. Therefore, you are responsible for the hazard. She handed Cora a bright yellow slip of paper. Right. You have 30 days to remove the waste and remediate the soil. After that, it's a $500 daily fine. Preston smiled, tapping the hood of his Range Rover. Best of luck with the cleanup, Cora. Let me know if you decide you want to sell the pasture. We'd still be willing to take it off your hands for a fair price. Considering the environmental liability you now have, of course. He slid back into his luxury SUV and drove away. That afternoon, Cora sat in the dusty, cramped office of Arthur Pendleton, a local attorney who charged less than he should and drank more coffee than was medically advisable. Arthur reviewed the citation and Preston's survey map. He rubbed his temples. It's a squeeze play, Cora, Arthur said grimly. Preston knows that 1922 map is likely superseded by adverse possession laws since your family has maintained that fence line for decades. If we take him to civil court, we will win. Then let's take him to court, Cora said fiercely. We can't, Arthur replied quietly. A property line dispute like this, against a billionaire's legal team, will take 3 to 5 years to resolve. They will file injunctions, discovery requests, and appeals just to drain your bank account. Meanwhile, that county inspector doesn't care about a civil lawsuit. In 30 days, you start getting fined $500 a day. In 2 months, the county will place a lien on your farm. In 6 months, the bank will foreclose. Preston is banking on the fact that you can't afford to fight him and clean up the mess at the same time. Cora felt the air leave her lungs. How much to hire a hazmat crew to remove 800 barrels? Arthur pulled up a browser on his computer. I made a few calls while you were driving over. Commercial wine barrels are heavy, bulky, and classified as industrial bio-waste due to the mold and acidity. The cheapest quote I got to haul them to a specialized facility in Fresno was $28,000. Cora closed her eyes. The room spun. She didn't have $28,000. She barely had 4. Preston Castelli had found the perfect loophole. He was going to bury her in his trash, and the law was going to let him do it. By day 12 of the 30-day grace period, the farm felt like a funeral home. Cora had called every junk hauler, every recycling plant, and every landscaping company within a 200-mile radius. Nobody wanted 800 rotting wine barrels. The ones that did want them wanted exorbitant amounts of money just to bring their heavy machinery onto the mud-soaked field. It was a miserable, gray Wednesday afternoon. A light drizzle was falling, turning the dust on the barrels into a dark, slick grime. Cora walked down to the pile. She was exhausted. Her bones ached. The bank had called that morning, leaving a polite but firm voicemail about her upcoming mortgage payment. She stood in front of the towering wall of oak, feeling smaller and more defeated than she ever had in her life. She looked at the Castelli logo burned into the wood. The sheer arrogance of it, something inside Cora snapped. She walked back to the machine shed, her boots heavy in the mud. She bypassed her tools, bypassed the tractor keys, and grabbed a 10-pound steel sledgehammer. She marched back down to the lower pasture, her breathing heavy, rain mixing with hot tears of frustration on her cheeks. She walked up to a barrel resting at the base of the pile. She raised the sledgehammer high over her head, let out a raw, screaming grunt of pure rage, and brought the steel head crashing down onto the center of the barrel. Crack! The sound was like a gunshot. The heavy, galvanized steel hoop securing the center of the barrel groaned and warped. Cora swung again, hitting the exact same spot. The rusted metal hoop snapped with a sharp ping, flying off into the wet grass. Without the tension of the hoop, the thick wooden staves, the vertical planks that made up the belly of the barrel, bowed outward. Cora dropped the hammer, breathing hard. She knelt in the mud and grabbed one of the loose wooden staves, wrestling it free from the top and bottom hoops. It took all her strength, but the heavy piece of wood finally gave way, pulling loose from the barrel head. She fell backward into the dirt, holding the plank. It was nearly 3 feet long, 2 inches thick, and incredibly heavy. The outside of the wood was ugly, gray, stained with dirt, weather-beaten and scarred by forklifts. But as Cora turned the stave over, she stopped. The inside of the barrel stave was completely different. The wood here hadn't been exposed to the elements. It had been soaking in ultra-premium Pinot Noir for 5 years. The oak was stained a deep, violent, breathtaking shade of burgundy. It looked like crushed velvet, and when she brought it close to her face, it didn't smell like rotting garbage. It smelled intoxicating. It smelled of dark cherries, vanilla, toasted spices, and rich, wet earth. "Hey, boss." Cora looked up. Benji, her 22-year-old farmhand and resident mechanic, was standing a few feet away, rain dripping off the brim of his baseball cap. He had been with the farm since he was a teenager, and he looked at the pile of barrels with the same quiet despair she felt. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. "Losing my mind, I think," Cora muttered, tossing the heavy stave toward him. "Look at this. It's solid." Benji caught the stave. He almost dropped it from the unexpected weight. He frowned, running his grease-stained thumb over the deep purple wood. He pulled a folding pocket knife from his jeans and scraped the edge of the wood, peeling away a thin curl of the gray, weathered exterior to reveal the bright, pale wood beneath. Benji's eyes widened. He wiped the rain from his face and walked over to the shattered barrel. He looked closely at the top rim, inspecting the grain of the wood. "Cora," Benji said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you know what this is?" "Trash," she replied bitterly. "Castelli's trash." "No," Benji said, shaking his head rapidly. "Look at the grain. Look how straight it is. This isn't just oak, it's quarter sawn. And look at this cooperage stamp on the head." He pointed to a small, heat-branded seal near the rim. "Nevers, France. These aren't standard American oak barrels. These are French oak. Castelli only uses the best. These cost him probably $1,200 to $1,500 each when they were new. And now they're old and useless," Cora argued. "The oak flavor leaches out into the wine. After 3 or 4 vintages, the wineries can't use them anymore. They're dead wood to him." "Dead to him, maybe," Benji said, his mind racing. "But Cora, my dad is a cabinet maker. Do you have any idea what quarter-sawn French oak costs per board foot in a lumber yard? Especially seasoned aged oak with a natural wine stain. People pay a fortune for fake patinas that look half this good." Cora stood up slowly, wiping the mud off her jeans. She looked at the stave in Benji's hand, then looked up at the towering pile of 800 barrels. "Help me load 3 of these into the back of the truck," Cora said, her voice suddenly entirely devoid of defeat. They hauled the heavy intact barrels up to the main barn. In the back corner of the structure sat her grandfather's old woodworking shop. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, but the heavy cast-iron tools, a massive table saw, a thickness planer, and a sturdy jointer, were industrial grade and built to last a century. For the next 8 hours, they forgot about the rain. They forgot about the bank. They meticulously dismantled the 3 barrels, removing the steel hoops and breaking the drum down into individual staves. They ran the staves through the thickness planer. The deafening scream of the blades filled the barn as decades of grime, gray weather, and warehouse dirt were shaved away. What emerged from the other side of the machine was breathtaking. The exterior of the staves revealed pristine, tight-grained golden French oak. But the true magic was the interior. They left the deep, wine-stained inside completely untouched, preserving the rich, crystallized burgundy color and the toasted char marks from when the cooper originally bent the wood over an open fire. Cora wasn't an expert carpenter, but she had grown up fixing fences, framing sheds, and building farm furniture. She knew how to measure twice and cut once. Using the natural, gentle curve of the staves, they began to build. They used heavy lag bolts to secure the wood. Benji took an angle grinder to the rusted galvanized barrel hoops, buffing the steel until it shined like brushed gunmetal, and bent them to serve as industrial, decorative brackets. By 2 a.m., exactly 24 hours after Preston Castelli had dumped his trash, They stepped back and wiped the sawdust from their eyes. Sitting on the barn floor was a coffee table. It was massive, heavy, and undeniably beautiful. The top was composed of the golden French oak, seamlessly joined. The legs were made from the deeply curved staves, displaying the rich, dark, wine-stained interior outward. The brushed steel hoops wrapped around the base, giving it a rugged, modern industrial elegance. It didn't look like a farm project. It looked like something you would see in a high-end luxury catalog in Aspen or Napa. "Take a picture," Cora whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She carried the table out to the farmhouse porch, waiting for the morning sun to rise. When the natural light hit the wood, the red wine stains seemed to glow from within. She snapped 3 photos with her phone. Cora opened an app for a popular online artisan marketplace. She had used it occasionally to sell vintage farm tools, but never furniture. She created a new listing: handcrafted solid French oak and wine-stained coffee table, reclaimed Castelli estate barrels. She hesitated at the price box. She thought about the labor. She thought about the $28,000 she needed. She typed in $850 and hit publish. Cora went to the kitchen, poured a cup of stale coffee, and sat at the table. She was completely exhausted, running on adrenaline and sawdust. She put her head down on her arms, just resting her eyes for a second. Her phone buzzed violently against the wood. She jumped, nearly spilling her coffee. She snatched up the phone. It was an email notification from the marketplace app. "Your item is sold." Cora stared at the screen, her mouth dry. A buyer named Julianne, an interior designer based in a wealthy zip code in San Francisco, had purchased the table at full price. But there was also a direct message attached to the order. Cora opened it, her hands trembling. "Julianne, this piece is absolutely stunning. The authentic winery provenance is exactly what my clients look for. Do you happen to have a matching dining room set? Or more of these coffee tables? I am staging in a boutique hotel in Marin County, and I would immediately purchase 6 more if you have the materials." Cora looked out her kitchen window. The rain had stopped. Down in the lower pasture, the morning sun was reflecting off the mountain of 800 oak wine barrels. Preston Castelli thought he had dumped garbage to destroy her. Instead, he had delivered over 24,000 pieces of premium, imported luxury lumber directly to her doorstep. Free of charge. Cora smiled, the expression sharp and dangerous. "Benji," Cora called out, walking out onto the porch. "Fire up the tractor. We're going logging." By sunrise on Thursday, Cora's farm had ceased to be a failing dairy operation and had morphed into a high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled lumber mill. The math was brutal. They had exactly 18 days before the Environmental Protection Division's deadline expired. If even a fraction of the 800 barrels remained on the pasture by day 30, the county would levy a $500 daily fine, triggering the bank's foreclosure clause. But now, they didn't just have to move the barrels. They had to process them, build with them, and ship them. "We need manpower, and we need it yesterday," Cora told Benji as they stood in the sawdust-covered barn, drinking their 4th pot of coffee. Benji nodded, pulling out his phone. "My dad is in. He's bringing his heavy-duty planer and a commercial joiner. I'll call Liam and Wyatt from the feed store. They've been cutting their hours anyway. We pay them $25 an hour in cash. They'll work until they drop." Within 4 hours, the Higgins farm was a hive of deafening activity. Benji's father, Thomas, a burly, retired cabinet maker with a missing index finger and an encyclopedic knowledge of wood grains, took one look at the deep burgundy interior of the French oak staves and nearly wept. He immediately took charge of the milling station. They established a relentless, specialized assembly line. The breakers. Liam and Wyatt were stationed down in the mud of the lower pasture. Armed with heavy sledgehammers and crowbars, they smashed the galvanized steel hoops off the barrels, stacking the loose staves into the beds of 2 pickup trucks. The millers. Benji and Thomas manned the heavy machinery in the barn, They ran thousands of raw staves through the thickness planers, stripping away the gray rot to reveal the pristine gold and deep purple wood, then squared the edges on the jointers. The fabricator. Cora handled the assembly and finishing. She took Julianne's request for 6 tables, measured the angles, drilled the pilot holes, and drove the heavy lag bolts home. The work was agonizing. The heavy oak splintered viciously, finding its way through heavy leather work gloves. The noise of the planers was a constant, shrieking whine that rattled their teeth, even through heavy earmuffs. The barn smelled intensely of toasted vanilla, damp earth, and hot metal. By day 4 of the operation, Cora's hands were taped and bleeding, her back screamed in protest, and she was functioning on 3 hours of sleep a night. But the results were undeniable. They weren't just making coffee tables anymore. Thomas had designed a line of high-end Adirondack chairs, utilizing the natural curve of the staves. Cora had built a massive 12-foot dining table that showcased the sweeping, wine-stained interiors of 50 different barrels, locked together in a flawless herringbone pattern. They branded the venture Higgins Heritage Oak. When Julianne's freight truck arrived to pick up the 6 coffee tables for the Marin County Boutique Hotel, the driver handed Cora a certified cashier's check for $5,100. It was the most money she had held in her hands in 3 years. She drove straight to the bank, depositing the check and paying her ballooning mortgage payment with exactly 4 hours to spare before default. But Julianne wasn't just a buyer. She was a megaphone in the wealthy echo chamber of Bay Area interior design. Photos of the Higgins Heritage tables, complete with the authentic burnished cooperage stamps from Never France, hit Instagram. Suddenly, Cora's inbox was exploding. A winery in Napa wanted 30 bar stools. A tech startup in Silicon Valley ordered a $9,000 custom conference table. A luxury restaurant chain in Seattle requested 45 dining tables, sending a $20,000 deposit via wire transfer. The mountain of trash in the lower pasture was shrinking, but as the pile diminished, the noise of Cora's success began to echo across the valley, and it didn't take long for it to reach the wrong ears. Preston Castelli rarely left his climate-controlled office, but the grand opening of the Lumina Retreat, a hyper-exclusive boutique hotel in Marin County, was a mandatory networking event. Dressed in a bespoke tuxedo, Preston was sipping a glass of his own $200 Pinot Noir when he leaned against the lobby's centerpiece, a massive, ruggedly elegant coffee table. He admired the brushed steel hoops and the rich, burgundy-stained wood. It was exactly the kind of rustic chic aesthetic he appreciated. He ran his hand over the polished surface, looking closely at the grain. Then, his blood ran cold, sanded down, but still unmistakably heat-branded into the corner of the table's surface was the crest of Castelli Estate Vineyards. Preston dropped his wine glass. It shattered on the marble floor. At 9 a.m. the following Monday, a sleek silver Mercedes pulled into the muddy driveway of the Higgins farm. Preston stepped out, followed closely by a man in a sharp gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. Harrison Cole, the Castelli family's lead corporate litigator. Cora was on the porch, covered in sawdust, drinking a protein shake. She watched them approach with cold, absolute calm. "Cora," Preston said, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. He looked past her to the barn, where the shrieking of power tools was deafening. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "Farming," Cora said flatly. Though the crop is a bit unorthodox. Harrison Cole stepped forward, opening his briefcase. "Ms. Higgins, I am corporate counsel for Castelli Vineyards. We have documented evidence that you have been illegally harvesting, manufacturing, and profiting from proprietary materials belonging to my client. Those barrels are the exclusive property of Castelli Estate." Is that right?" Cora asked, taking a slow sip of her shake. "We are issuing an immediate cease and desist," Harrison continued, handing her a thick stack of legal documents. "Furthermore, we are filing an injunction to freeze your business accounts as the capital was generated through the sale of stolen property. You will cease all manufacturing today or we will have the sheriff arrest you for grand larceny." Preston smirked, crossing his arms. "You really thought you could just steal my inventory and sell it to my own social circle, Cora? You're done." "Hold on a second, Harrison," a raspy voice called out. Arthur Pendleton, Cora's perpetually caffeinated, rumpled attorney, stepped out of the farmhouse kitchen. He was holding a yellow slip of paper and smiling like a shark. "Arthur," Harrison said, his lip curling in distaste, "you're out of your depth here. She's fencing stolen goods." "Not according to the county of Sonoma, she isn't," Arthur said, walking down the porch steps. He held up the bright yellow EPD citation. "Do you remember this, Preston? The hazardous waste citation." Preston frowned. "The citation for the waste on her property." "Yes, exactly," Arthur beamed. "Under California Civil Code, when a party deliberately dumps materials onto the property of another and subsequently denies ownership to a regulatory body to avoid environmental cleanup fees, that property is legally classified as abandoned waste. You can't have it both ways, Preston." Arthur pulled a second document from his jacket, a transcript. "On October 14th, in front of Sheriff Miller and an EPD inspector, you explicitly stated, and I quote, 'The land is ours,' which means the barrels stay. You claimed the land in a civil dispute, but you officially refused to claim the barrels as valuable inventory to avoid the hazardous waste tax. By forcing the liability onto Cora as the registered property owner, you legally surrendered the asset." Harrison Cole's face drained of color. He looked at Preston. "Why, did you actually say that to a county inspector?" "I was trying to bankrupt her with the fines," Preston hissed, his composure cracking. "Well, congratulations," Arthur said cheerfully. "You gave her $250,000 in premium French oak. The legal doctrine of res derelicta applies here. You abandoned it. She claimed it. She processed it. It's hers. If you try to freeze her accounts, I will countersue for malicious prosecution, and I will depose you in front of the EPD for falsifying environmental liability." Preston stared at Arthur, then at Cora. His jaw clenched so hard Cora thought his teeth might crack. "This isn't over," Preston whispered venomously. He turned and stormed back to the Mercedes. Cora watched the car tear out of her driveway, spitting gravel. She looked at Arthur. "Are we actually clear?" Arthur's smile faded slightly. "Legally, yes, he can't touch your business or the wood. But Preston is a billionaire who just got humiliated by a dairy farmer. He's not going to fight you in a courtroom anymore, Cora. He's going to fight dirty." Arthur's warning proved prophetic. 48 hours later, Cora was in the barn, putting the final coat of tung oil on the massive 45 table order for the Seattle restaurant chain. It was her magnum opus. The tables were flawlessly constructed, highlighting the rich, intoxicating reds and deep purples of the wine-soaked oak. This single order was worth $45,000. It would pay off her entire year's operating debt, fund a new roof for the dairy barn, and leave enough capital to formally incorporate Higgins Heritage Oak. The deadline for delivery to the freight depot in Santa Rosa was 5 p.m. on Friday. If they missed the outbound shipping train, the restaurant chain would invoke the delay penalty in the contract, voiding the sale and demanding their $20,000 deposit back. A deposit Cora had already spent on payroll, machinery, and lag bolts. It was Thursday afternoon when the phone rang. It was Greg, the manager of the local commercial freight company she had booked. "Cora, I am so sorry." Greg's voice was tight, laced with genuine distress. "I have to cancel your pickup tomorrow." Cora's stomach plummeted. "Greg, what? You can't. We booked this 2 weeks ago. I have 45 heavy oak tables sitting in my barn. I'll lose the contract." I know, Greg stammered. "But my hands are tied. Castelli Vineyards just bought out our parent company's regional logistics contract. They represent 80% of our outbound freight. Preston Castelli's operations manager called me 10 minutes ago. He said if any Higgins Farm products are loaded onto our trucks, Castelli will pull their entire account and bankrupt my depot." Cora closed her eyes. "He bought the shipping company." "Greg, please. I have a family, Cora. I can't lose my job. I'm sorry." The line went dead. Cora dropped the phone. The barn suddenly felt suffocatingly small. She looked at Benji and Thomas, who had stopped the planers, sensing the disaster. "They canceled the trucks," Cora said hollowly. "Preston threatened them. We have no way to move 10 tons of furniture to the rail yard by tomorrow afternoon." Benji kicked a pile of sawdust, swearing loudly. "I'll call around. U-Haul, Ryder, anyone." "It's too late," Thomas said, shaking his head. "To move 45 commercial tables, we need at least 3 53-foot dry vans. You can't rent those on 12 hours' notice." He boxed us in. Cora walked out of the barn. She looked down at the lower pasture. The mountain of barrels was gone. In its place was just muddy, churned-up earth. She had done the impossible. She had cleared the hazard, saved her farm, and built a thriving business from literal garbage. And Preston was going to destroy her anyway, just because he had a bigger checkbook. She leaned against the rusted hood of her Ford F-150, feeling the hot sting of tears behind her eyes. She looked out at the rolling hills of the valley. She saw the pristine, manicured rows of Castelli vines to the east. Then she looked to the west. She saw the sprawling, dusty properties of her actual neighbors. The people Preston had been trying to price out for a decade. She saw Old Man Henderson's cattle ranch. She saw the Martinez family's sheep farm. She saw the sprawling, rusted equipment yard of the local independent grain cooperative. Cora wiped her eyes. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, desperate clarity. She grabbed her phone and opened her contacts. She didn't dial a corporate freight company. She dialed Henderson. "Hey, Bill," Cora said, her voice steady. "Are you still running those triple-axle livestock trailers for the auction tomorrow?" "Sure am, Cora," the old rancher replied. "Why?" "I need a favor, a massive one, and I'm willing to pay triple the diesel rate." At 2 p.m. on Friday, 3 hours before the shipping deadline, Preston Castelli was sitting in his glass-walled office overlooking the valley, enjoying a victory espresso. His operations manager had assured him the Higgins freight was grounded. She would default on the restaurant contract by sunset. A low, rumbling vibration rattled the glass of his office window. Preston frowned. He stood up and walked to the balcony. Rolling down the main county highway, directly past the gilded, wrought-iron gates of Castelli Estate Vineyards, was a convoy. Leading the pack was Bill Henderson's massive, dented Peterbilt semi-truck, pulling a 50-foot aluminum cattle hauler. Behind him was the Martinez family's flatbed hay truck, stacked high. Behind them were 4 heavy-duty dually pickup trucks, pulling rusted, heavy equipment gooseneck trailers. The convoy smelled like diesel, cow manure, and wet hay. It was a rolling eyesore of working-class agriculture and securely strapped to the beds of every single trailer, wrapped in moving blankets and tarp, were 45 breathtaking, luxury French oak dining tables. As the lead truck passed the Castelli gates, Bill Henderson laid on his deafening air horn. Cora was sitting in the passenger seat of the Peterbilt. She rolled down the window, looking up at the glass balcony where Preston was standing. She didn't flip him off. She didn't yell. She just smiled, held up a single piece of deeply stained burgundy French oak, and gave him a polite, mocking salute. Fete. The convoy roared down the highway toward the Santa Rosa rail yard, leaving Preston standing in a cloud of exhaust, watching the garbage he threw away ride off to make a fortune. The arrival of the 45 Higgins Heritage Oak tables in Seattle didn't just save the farm. It detonated a bomb in the West Coast luxury furniture market. When the flagship restaurant opened, architectural digests and lifestyle magazines flooded the space to photograph the interior. The tables, with their brushed gunmetal hoops and violently beautiful burgundy-stained wood, stole the show. The articles didn't just praise the craftsmanship. They obsessed over the story, reclaimed from the ashes of a failing dairy farm, forged from ultra-premium French oak. By the end of November, Cora's inbox wasn't just full, it was unmanageable. They were pulling in $40,000 to $60,000 a week in gross sales. Cora officially incorporated Higgins Heritage Oak, LLC. She hired Bill Henderson to manage logistics permanently, allowing him to retire his grueling livestock runs. She hired 4 more farmhands from neighboring properties, paying them double the county average to run the sanders and assembly lines. The dusty, dilapidated dairy barn was transformed. Cora invested $85,000 of her new capital into state-of-the-art equipment, a Laguna Industrial CNC router, a massive centralized dust collection system that snaked along the rafters, and commercial-grade HVLP spray booths for applying perfect coats of satin lacquer. For the first time in her life, Cora wasn't checking her bank account with a sense of impending doom. She bought Benji a brand new set of snap-on tools and paid Thomas a hefty retainer as her master designer. The mountain of 800 barrels in the lower pasture had been reduced to a manageable pile of about 200. Life was finally good, which meant, inevitably, the other shoe was about to drop. Preston Castelli had spent the last month stewing in a state of absolute, venomous humiliation. He had watched the cattle trucks parade past his gates. He had read the architectural magazines praising the rustic brilliance of the wood he had literally thrown away. He had become a laughingstock at his country club, known as the billionaire who accidentally bankrolled a dairy farmer's empire. Preston didn't do well with humiliation, and he certainly didn't do well with losing. He sat in his sprawling, glass-walled office, nursing a glass of bourbon, watching the distant lights of Cora's barn burning brightly into the night. Beside him stood David Mercer, a ruthless financial acquisitions manager who specialized in corporate restructuring. "She beat the environmental liability," Preston said, his voice deadly quiet. "She bypassed the freight embargo. I want another angle, David. I don't care what it costs. I want that farm leveled, and I want her bankrupt." David adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, opening a sleek leather folder. "I've dug into her financials, Preston. She's cash-rich right now, but she has a massive underlying vulnerability. Her primary mortgage. She's been making her payments," Preston snapped. "I checked." "She has," David agreed, "but her mortgage is held by Valley Mutual, a small regional community bank. They've been struggling with liquidity for the last 2 quarters due to a high default rate on agricultural loans. For a firm of our size, Valley Mutual isn't a bank. It's a target." Preston turned away from the window, his eyes narrowing. "Explain." "Through the Castelli Holding Group, we can execute a quiet, hostile buyout of Valley Mutual's distressed agricultural debt portfolio," David explained, a cold smile forming on his lips. "We buy the paper. We become the bank. And once we hold the mortgage on the Higgins farm, we invoke Clause 14B, which is the change of use covenant," David said. "Cora Higgins's loan was issued for the operation of a dairy and livestock farm. She is currently running a high-volume commercial manufacturing and industrial woodworking facility on land zoned strictly for agriculture. It is a direct violation of the loan's covenants. If the lender, which will soon be you, determines the property is being misused, they have the right to accelerate the debt." Preston's smile returned, cruel and sharp. "Acceleration, meaning the entire balance becomes due immediately." "Exactly," David nodded. $412,000, payable in exactly 30 days. If she misses the deadline by a single second, the property goes into foreclosure and you seize the land for pennies on the dollar. 3 days later, Cora was in the spray booth, wearing a respirator and applying a flawless coat of lacquer to a custom conference table, when Arthur Pendleton's beat-up sedan skidded into the driveway. The attorney didn't look his usual, rumpled, fiercely optimistic self. He looked pale. He was holding a thick manila envelope that had been delivered by a certified courier. Cora shut off the compressor, pulled down her respirator, and stepped out of the booth. "Arthur, what's wrong?" "Let's go into the kitchen," Arthur said quietly. "Now." 10 minutes later, Cora sat at her kitchen table, staring at the legal notice. The words blurred together, but the numbers burned into her retinas. Balance due, $412,500, deadline December 15th. "How is this legal?" Cora whispered, her hands shaking. "I've never missed a payment, not since the business took off. I'm 3 months ahead." "It's not about the payments, Cora," Arthur said, rubbing his eyes exhaustedly. It's a commercial loan covenant violation. Castelli's holding company bought out a massive chunk of Valley Mutual's portfolio. He owns your debt now, and he's weaponizing the zoning laws. You're zoned for cows, not CNC machines. He's calling the loan due. I have $80,000 in the business account, Cora said, her voice rising in panic. I can't liquidate $400,000 in 30 days. Even with the holiday orders, it's impossible. We'd have to sell the machinery, the inventory, everything. And even if you did, you'd have no business left, and he still gets the land if you fall short by a single dollar, Arthur said grimly. I've looked for a loophole, Cora. I've spent the last 48 hours tearing through banking regulations. It's ironclad. He found the one weakness we couldn't protect. Cora looked out the window toward the lower pasture. The winter frost was setting in. She had fought so hard. She had bled. She had stayed awake for days. She had rallied her community. And with the stroke of a pen in a corporate boardroom, Preston Castelli was going to wipe it all away. So what do we do? Cora asked, her voice hollow. Arthur looked at her with profound sadness. You declare bankruptcy to protect your personal assets, and you let him take the farm. The atmosphere in the barn the next morning was akin to a morgue. Cora had called the crew together and broken the news. There were no tears, just a heavy, suffocating silence. Benji had thrown his wrench across the shop, shattering a window. Thomas had quietly packed his beloved hand planes into his wooden toolbox. We have 28 days until the foreclosure goes through, Cora told them, her voice devoid of emotion. I'm going to fulfill the open orders we have so I can pay you all severance. But after that, we're shutting down the machines. They went back to work, but the fire was gone. They were no longer building an empire. They were building their own coffins. They were processing the very bottom layer of the barrel pile, the last 150 drums that had been resting directly on the damp earth since Preston had dumped them. Because these barrels had been at the bottom of the avalanche, they were heavily damaged. The steel hoops were crushed, and the staves were coated in thick black mud and dried wine lees. Benji was working the jointer, running a mud-caked stave over the spinning blades to square the edge. As the blade bit into the wood, a cloud of dust erupted. But it wasn't the usual sweet, toasted vanilla scent of French oak. Benji coughed violently, stepping back from the machine. Whoa! What the hell is that? Cora looked up from her workbench. What's wrong? Smell that, Benji said, pointing to the jointer. He pulled his shirt up over his nose. Cora walked over. As she neared the machine, a sharp, acrid chemical odor hit her nostrils. It smelled like burning plastic mixed with ammonia and bleach. It stung her eyes instantly. Thomas walked over, frowning. He reached down and picked up the freshly milled stave. The interior wasn't the usual deep, crystallized burgundy. It was a strange, sickly, iridescent purple, almost black in the center. This isn't wine, Thomas murmured, his thick fingers tracing the bizarre discoloration. As he rubbed the wood, a fine, powdery residue came off on his skin. Suddenly, Thomas hissed in pain, dropping the stave. Ah, son of a... He looked at his hand. The skin where he had touched the residue was already turning a bright, angry red, blistering rapidly as if he had touched a hot stove. Don't touch it, Cora yelled, grabbing a rag and throwing it over the wood. Benji, go get the first aid kit. Get the saline wash. They rushed Thomas to the sink, frantically washing his hand. The chemical burn was severe, requiring a thick layer of burn cream and heavy gauze. Cora walked slowly back to the jointer. She put on a pair of heavy rubber chemical gloves and picked up the stave. She inspected the outside of the wood, where the cooperage stamps usually sat. This barrel didn't just have the Castelli crest. It had a thick, bright red stripe spray-painted across the top rim. Benji, Cora said urgently, go down to the pasture. Look at the remaining barrels from this bottom batch. See if they have red stripes. Benji ran out into the cold morning air. He returned 5 minutes later, out of breath. Every single one of them, about 140 barrels, all marked with a red stripe. Cora, what is going on? Cora stared at the wood, her mind racing. She remembered the arrogant EPD inspector who had cited her months ago. Wine lees are highly acidic. They can ruin the water table, but standard wine lees, just dead yeast and grape skins, didn't cause severe chemical burns on contact. No, they didn't smell like ammonia. Preston didn't dump these barrels just to spite me, Cora whispered, the realization hitting her like a freight train. He dumped them because he couldn't dispose of them legally. What do you mean? Thomas asked, clutching his bandaged hand. Standard winery waste is picked up by commercial agricultural haulers, Cora explained, her eyes wide. They take it to specialized composting facilities. But those facilities test the waste for hazardous materials before they accept it. If Preston had sent these red-striped barrels to a commercial dump, they would have tested them, and they would have found whatever this is. She looked at the toxic, iridescent wood. He bypassed the commercial haulers, she continued, her voice trembling with rising adrenaline. He used his own trucks in the middle of the night. He dumped them on my land so that I would be legally responsible for the environmental hazard, shielding his estate from the liability. Cora, Benji said slowly, Castelli Vineyards is certified organic. It's the entire basis of his brand. He charges $200 a bottle because he claims his grapes are dry farmed, with 0 synthetic interventions. Exactly, Cora said. She grabbed a clean, heavy-duty trash bag and carefully slid the toxic stave inside, sealing it tight. If he's using something illegal in his winemaking process, and it's soaked into the wood, it would destroy his entire empire. She stripped off her rubber gloves and grabbed her keys. I'm going to Berkeley. 3 hours later, Cora was standing in the brightly lit reception area of the Pacific Agricultural Testing Laboratory, a private, high-end chemical analysis firm often used by universities and massive corporate farms. She slammed the trash bag onto the front counter. I need an emergency mass spectrometry analysis on this wood, Cora told the startled receptionist. I need a full chemical breakdown of every synthetic compound soaked into the grain, and I will pay whatever the rush fee is to get it by tomorrow morning. The next 24 hours were agonizing. Cora didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, watching the clock tick down on her foreclosure. At 9 a.m. on Thursday, her phone rang. It was Dr. Mitchell, the lead toxicologist at the Berkeley lab. Ms. Higgins, Dr. Mitchell said, his voice deadly serious. I need to know exactly where you acquired this wood. Why? What did you find? Cora demanded. I found a nightmare, Dr. Mitchell replied. The wood is saturated in a compound called phenhexamide, mixed with an unregistered bootleg synthetic stabilizing agent likely imported illegally. It's a chemical fungicide used to prevent rot in grapes during exceptionally wet harvests. Is it illegal? In the state of California? Extremely, Dr. Mitchell said. It is highly toxic to aquatic life, it poisons groundwater, and it causes severe dermal burns upon contact. If a winery is using this, they aren't just losing their organic certification. The EPA will shut the entire operation down. The FDA will recall every bottle of wine they've shipped, and the owner is looking at federal prison time for agricultural dumping. Dr. Mitchell paused. Ms. Higgins, I am legally obligated to report these findings to the Environmental Protection Agency within 48 hours. Cora felt a cold, ruthless smile spread across her face. Dr. Mitchell, Cora said smoothly, I fully support you reporting this to the EPA, but I need you to hold off for exactly 24 hours. Email me the certified lab results right now. Cora hung up the phone. She didn't call Arthur to cry about the foreclosure. She called him to prepare for war. The Castelli Estates' annual Winter Vintners Gala was the most exclusive event in Sonoma County. Held in Preston's sprawling, ultra-modern glass tasting room overlooking the valley, it was a gathering of venture capitalists, high-end restaurant buyers, and elite wine critics. Preston was in his element, dressed in a midnight blue velvet tuxedo jacket. He was holding court near a massive stone fireplace, swirling a glass of his flagship reserve, Pinot Noir, soaking in the adulation of his wealthy peers. He was untouchable. The Higgins farm would be his in 2 weeks. His empire was expanding. The heavy oak doors of the tasting room swung open. The room went silent. Cora Higgins stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing a dress. She was wearing her scuffed leather work boots, faded denim jeans, and her heavy Carhartt jacket. Beside her stood Arthur Pendleton, clutching his battered leather briefcase, looking terrifyingly confident. Preston's smile vanished. His security guards, two large men in dark suits, immediately moved toward the door. "Miss Higgins," Preston said, projecting his voice to sound amused, though his eyes were frantic. "You are trespassing on private property. Security will escort you out." "I wouldn't do that, Preston," Cora said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent, glittering room. "Unless you want me to hand these documents to the reporter from Wine Spectator, standing right next to the bar." Preston froze. He looked at Arthur, who simply tapped his briefcase. "My office, now," Preston hissed. He led them down a private hallway into his soundproofed executive suite, slamming the door behind them. David Mercer, his financial manager, was already inside, looking bewildered. "Are you insane?" Preston exploded, rounding on Cora. "I will have you arrested. You have 2 weeks left before I bulldoze your pathetic barn into the mud." Cora didn't flinch. She reached into her jacket, pulled out the thick, red-stamped laboratory report from Berkeley, and tossed it onto Preston's mahogany desk. "Take a look, Preston," Cora said coldly. "We finally got around to processing the bottom layer of your garbage, the barrels with the red stripes." Preston's face, previously flushed with anger, instantly drained of all blood. He stared at the report as if it were a live rattlesnake. David Mercer frowned, stepping forward to pick up the document. "What is this?" "Don't touch it," Preston barked, slapping David's hand away. "I'll tell you what it is, David," Arthur said cheerfully, leaning against the doorframe. "It's a certified mass spectrometry analysis, proving that Castelli Vineyards has been secretly soaking its certified organic grapes in illegal, highly toxic phenhexamide fungicides. It proves your boss committed a federal environmental crime by dumping hazardous bio-waste on a neighbor's property to avoid EPA detection." "That's a lie," Preston whispered, his voice cracking. "You tampered with the wood." "The lab results are time-stamped and certified by a third-party toxicologist," Cora said, stepping closer to the desk. "And Dr. Mitchell is legally required to forward this exact report to the EPA tomorrow at noon. The FDA will follow. They will test your soil. They will test your current vintage. They will pull your wine from every shelf in the country." Preston fell backward into his leather desk chair, breathing heavily. He looked at David, but the financial manager was already backing away, his eyes wide with horror, realizing the colossal liability he was standing next to. "What do you want?" Preston choked out. "Arthur," Cora said, not taking her eyes off Preston. Arthur opened his briefcase and pulled out 3 legal documents, laying them neatly on the desk. "Document 1, Arthur announced, handing Preston a gold-plated pen. "A full, absolute discharge and forgiveness of the $412,500 mortgage held by Valley Mutual. The Higgins farm will be owned free and clear by Cora Higgins, effective immediately." Preston's hand shook as he picked up the pen. He signed it. "Document 2, Arthur continued. "A quit-claim deed. You are permanently transferring ownership of the disputed 50-acre lower pasture to Cora Higgins, relinquishing any and all future claims to the property line." Preston squeezed his eyes shut, a vein pulsing in his temple. He signed it. "And document 3, Cora said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You dumped a toxic biohazard on my land. I am a commercial remediation contractor now. I will safely and legally dispose of your red-striped barrels at a specialized hazardous waste facility. My fee for this service is $250,000. Payable by wire transfer. Right now." Preston looked up at her, pure hatred burning in his eyes. "You're extorting me." "I'm billing you for cleanup," Cora corrected flawlessly. "Sign it, or I walk back out into that tasting room and hand the lab report to the press." Preston Castelli, the billionaire golden boy of Sonoma Valley, broke. He signed the final document, his signature jagged and weak. He opened his laptop, logged into his holding company's banking portal, and authorized the wire transfer. Cora's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. "Deposit confirmed." $250,000. Cora looked down at Preston. He looked small, defeated, and hollow. "Next time you want to throw your trash over the fence, Preston," Cora said softly, "make sure you know who you're throwing it at." She turned and walked out of the office, Arthur right behind her. They didn't go back through the tasting room. They walked out the side exit, stepping into the crisp, cool California night. Cora looked up at the stars, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The air tasted incredibly sweet. 1 year later, the Higgins farm was unrecognizable. The dilapidated dairy operation was completely gone. The cows had been relocated to a lush, sprawling pasture on the newly acquired 50 acres, living out their days as pampered pets. The rusted silos had been replaced by 3 massive, climate-controlled lumber kilns. Higgins' heritage oak had exploded. They weren't just using Castelli's barrels anymore. Wineries from across the state, desperate for the positive PR, were paying Cora to haul away their spent French oak. She had 20 full-time employees, a fleet of delivery trucks, and a wait list for her furniture that stretched 8 months long. Cora stood on her back porch, drinking coffee from a ceramic mug, watching the morning sun rise over the valley. Buster the blue heeler sat at her feet. Down in the lower pasture, there was no mountain of rotting wood. There was no toxic waste. There was only endless green grass and the humming, vibrant sound of a business built from the ground up. She had taken the weapon meant to destroy her and used it to carve out an empire. And she had built it all on a foundation of solid, unbreakable oak. Cora's journey from a desperate dairy farmer to a 6-figure furniture CEO proves that sometimes your biggest obstacles are actually your greatest opportunities. Preston Castelli tried to bury her in toxic waste, but he only handed her the raw materials to build an empire. She didn't just survive the sabotage, she outsmarted a billionaire at his own game. If you love this true story of grit, revenge, and sweet justice, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a little motivation today, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life stories. See you next time.